I'm Isabelle Carter, and I just turned 32. Most people in my family think I'm the disappointment, the one who never quite measured up. They believe I've spent the last few years managing a quiet little bookstore in Brooklyn. What they don't know is that I'm the founder and CEO of Bright Path Learning, a tech company now valued at over $90 million. If you've ever felt overlooked or underestimated by your own family, you're not alone. Before I tell you how a birthday dinner changed everything, let me know where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this channel if you believe success means more than just status. I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, in a family that once knew what it meant to struggle, but somewhere along the way forgot how to stay grounded. My father, William Carter, built a real estate empire from the ground up. He came from nothing. His father was a mechanic, his mother a seamstress. He used to say that hard work was his inheritance, and I believed him, at least I used to. My mother, Victoria, grew up in the same modest neighborhood, but you'd never guess it now. She turned our family's newfound wealth into a ladder to climb the social hierarchy, throwing fundraisers, joining elite clubs, and curating every detail of our lives so we'd appear perfect to the world. My older siblings, Alexandra and Nicholas, fit seamlessly into that mold. Alexandra went to Yale Law and built a high-powered career in corporate litigation. Nicholas became a plastic surgeon, with a client list made up mostly of celebrities and socialites. Their lives were made for holiday cards and press releases. And then, there was me. I was the quiet one, always reading, always questioning. I cared about people, about stories, about fairness, things that didn't glitter enough for my family to notice. My mother would look at me and sigh, always with that line, "Why can't you be more like your sister?" My achievements were rarely acknowledged, unless they could be spun into something presentable. For a while, I tried to play their game. I earned a business degree from NYU, not quite Ivy League, but close enough to ease my mother's shame. I landed a corporate job in Manhattan. On paper, I was everything they wanted, but inside, I was drowning. The endless meetings, the shallow office politics, it all felt meaningless. I was working 80-hour weeks for people who didn't care if I vanished tomorrow. So 2 years in, I quit. And when I told my family, the silence was deafening. "You had such promise," my mother said, her voice tight with disappointment. "What will we tell people?" What they didn't know, what I made sure they didn't know, was that I wasn't quitting to collapse. I was quitting to build, and that decision would change everything. But to understand why I hid it all for so long and how that choice came crashing into the light one unforgettable night, we have to go back to where it all began. I never told them about Bright Path. They assumed I had taken a small job at the corner bookstore near Prospect Park, the kind of place that smells like worn paper and cinnamon tea, where people read poetry aloud on Tuesday nights. I let them believe it. I even leaned into the role. I posted pictures of book displays, wore soft cardigans to family gatherings, and smiled through their well-meaning pity. Because the truth felt dangerous. My parents had built their lives around external markers, neighborhoods, degrees, titles, vacation homes. My siblings had followed suit. And somewhere along the way, love became conditional. It wasn't about who you were. It was about what you could show, what you could prove, what others could envy. So I kept my truth to myself, not out of shame, but out of something even more fragile, hope. I wanted to believe they could love me without all the shine, that if I stripped away the accolades, the bank accounts, the press features, if all I had left was my heart, my mind, my values, maybe they'd see me. Maybe they'd respect me for building something that mattered, even if it wasn't glamorous. But that's not how they saw it. To them, I had failed. I'd wasted my degree. I was the sibling who couldn't keep up, the one who needed help. Diana once tried to set me up with a guy she described as low maintenance for someone in your situation. Nicholas offered to help with rent after spotting my Honda Civic parked outside a family brunch. I thanked them both and politely declined, all while biting back the quiet fury in my chest. What they didn't know was that behind that Civic's dented bumper was a laptop filled with algorithms I had helped design, software being piloted in over 60 public schools across the country. What they didn't know was that I had just closed a $15 million Series B funding round and been invited to speak at the Global EdTech Forum in Geneva. But more than the accolades, what they didn't know was that I had found purpose. BrightPath wasn't just a business, it was a movement. We were building educational software for underfunded schools, refugee children, students with learning differences, kids who were being left behind. And every late night, every risk I took, every dollar I reinvested felt like a brick in something real, something lasting. Still, I stayed silent. I showed up to family events, handed over modest gifts, and listened as my siblings bragged about court victories and celebrity clients. I smiled through it all, even when my mother introduced me as our daughter who works with books. Because part of me needed to know, would they ever see my worth if it wasn't spelled out on a tax return? The answer was coming soon, but not in the way any of us expected. But it wasn't just about the present. The silence I chose didn't begin when I left my job or when I founded BrightPath. It started long before that, before adulthood, before expectations were printed on embossed holiday cards. It started in childhood, in the quiet corners where love was measured, weighed, and often withheld. I still remember the science fair in 5th grade. I spent weeks building a solar-powered irrigation model. I was so proud, so sure that this time they'd see me. But Alexandra had just won a regional debate competition, and the living room was filled with relatives watching her speech on VHS. No one came to the school gym. My teacher took a photo of me standing beside my project. I brought it home. It stayed on the fridge for 2 days, then vanished. That was the rhythm of my childhood. Achieve quietly. Don't expect applause. Sit at the kids' table even when your report card had more A's than anyone else's. Let Nicholas tell the same joke about his med school residency for the 100th time while you quietly clear the dishes. By the time I was 16, I had learned something dangerous. Invisibility could be easier than disappointment. So I stopped trying to impress them. I stopped bringing home certificates and stopped mentioning the short stories I published in the high school lit journal. The spotlight wasn't for me. It had already been claimed. I just tried to survive its shadow. Victoria, my mother, always said she wanted the best for us, and I believe she did, at least her version of best. But her love was transactional. Warmth followed accomplishment. Affection was rationed and never spontaneous. She dressed our lives in perfection, but underneath it all was a kind of emotional famine. And William, my father, wasn't cruel. He just faded. As his business grew, so did his distance. The man who once took me to the park on Sunday mornings with stale bread for the ducks became someone who canceled dinner plans last minute to take a call from the office. I used to sit on the front steps of our house in Savannah and imagine running away, not physically, but emotionally, escaping the hunger for their approval, learning to breathe in my own skin. Years later, I would build a company that helped kids who felt like they didn't belong, maybe because a part of me never really did. I wasn't driven by revenge. I wasn't out to prove anything. I just wanted peace. But no matter how much success I found, some wounds stayed tender, and I had no idea how sharply they would reopen at one dinner table, with one whispered sentence. Those old feelings, the ones I thought I'd buried, always had a way of creeping back around the holidays. Christmas at the Carter house had become more of a performance than a celebration. Glittering lights wrapped the front porch, name cards were printed in gold foil, and the dining table always had a centerpiece from some overpriced floral boutique in Manhattan. But beneath all the sparkle, nothing ever felt warm. Last year was no different. I arrived with a handmade gift bag and a carefully wrapped present, a wool throw blanket and a cashmere scarf I'd found in a quiet little shop in Beacon. It reminded me of the kind my grandmother used to knit, personal, thoughtful. But of course, that's not how it landed. My mother unwrapped it slowly, her manicured fingers tugging at the ribbon. "Oh," she said with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Very classic. I'm sure it's perfect for your budget." Then came Alexandra. She leaned across the table with a smirk and whispered just loud enough, "Did the bookstore give you a holiday bonus or something?" I tried to smile it off. "Some people give from the heart, not the wallet." Nicholas laughed under his breath. "That's what people say when they don't have a wallet." I remember gripping the edge of my chair, trying to breathe slowly. My father didn't say a word. He just glanced at his watch like he had somewhere better to be. It wasn't even the words that cut the deepest. It was the casualness. Like mocking me was tradition. Like they genuinely believed I couldn't possibly be happy unless I had what they had: status, wealth, applause. What none of them knew was that BrightPath had just secured a multi-year contract with the Department of Education that week. It was one of our biggest milestones yet. But I'd said nothing, not even a hint, because telling them would have felt like giving them a win they hadn't earned. They didn't ask about my life, my work, or what I believed in. They only measured worth by what you could parade in front of others. So I swallowed the moment. Again. I left that night with my scarf forgotten on the back of a chair and a hollow ache in my chest. Not because they misunderstood me, but because they didn't care to try. And as I stepped out into the cold, the snow falling quietly onto the sidewalk, I made a promise to myself. The next time they tried to dismiss me, I wouldn't disappear. After that night, I stopped hoping they'd ask. The truth is, I'd long ago created a version of myself they could dismiss. A version so quiet, so unassuming, that it allowed me the space to build something they'd never expect. Behind the curtain of their assumptions, I was pouring my soul into BrightPath. What started as a single idea scribbled in a notebook on my apartment floor had grown into a company with nearly 50 employees. We partnered with schools in rural Appalachia, inner-city Detroit, and immigrant communities in Queens. We built adaptive learning software for children with dyslexia, autism, ADHD, kids who had been labeled too difficult by outdated systems. And every time a principal called to say their students were reading at grade level for the first time, or a parent wrote to say their child finally felt seen, something in me healed, just a little. But it wasn't just about the mission. It was the freedom. The chance to shape a world I believed in, one line of code, one grant proposal, one school district at a time. The irony? The same creativity and determination my parents once called distracting were the exact tools that built a multi-million-dollar organization. Still, I kept my real life tucked away. To the world outside BrightPath, I was Isabelle Carter, quiet bookstore manager, hobbyist reader, harmless anomaly in a family of overachievers. My LinkedIn hadn't been updated in years. I rarely posted online. I never attended industry award dinners. I let my CTO take the spotlight, gave public credit to my team, and declined magazine interviews. Not because I lacked pride, but because I needed to know who I was without the noise. Because when you grow up in a house where love is doled out in return for performance, you start to confuse visibility with vulnerability, and vulnerability in my family was weakness. So I stayed in the shadows. I hosted strategy meetings in my living room, took investor calls from coffee shops, and signed partnership deals under a pseudonym at first, just to keep the noise away. But eventually, even the shadows grow too small. And as my father's birthday approached, something shifted. Maybe it was the weight of years, or maybe it was the exhaustion of pretending. But I felt something stir in me. Something that didn't want to hide anymore. I didn't know it yet, but that night would become the line between who I had been and who I was finally ready to be. The invitation arrived on thick, cream-colored cardstock, monogrammed and sealed with gold foil. It was for my father's 65th birthday, to be held at Maison Étoile, the kind of place where entrees don't have prices, and the waitstaff remember your wine preferences better than your family does. I stared at it for a long time. A part of me wanted to toss it in a drawer and pretend I hadn't seen it, but another part, stronger now, louder, told me this was the moment. Not for revenge, not even for recognition, but for truth. It had been 3 months since my father's minor heart attack. He'd recovered quickly, brushing it off like an inconvenience, but I hadn't forgotten the tremble in my mother's voice when she called. I hadn't forgotten what it felt like to imagine losing him without ever really being seen by him. That phone call had haunted me quietly ever since, so when the invitation came, I knew I had to go. But how? How do you walk into a room where you've always been overlooked and suddenly hold the kind of power your family worships, but never thought you had? Part of me wanted to show up in head-to-toe designer, makeup flawless, jewelry speaking in decimals. I could have worn the custom dress my team had gifted me after our company passed $80 million in valuation. I could have walked in and let them drown in their own assumptions. But that wasn't me. That would have been their language, not mine. Instead, I planned something quieter, something that would let them reveal themselves, just as they always had. I picked out a simple black dress, tailored just enough to suggest quiet elegance. I laid out my grandmother's pearl earrings, small and understated, and I wrapped a gift for my father that I'd spent nearly a year finding, a first-edition copy of his favorite Steinbeck novel, East of Eden. It cost more than most luxury watches, but I knew no one in my family would see its value. That was the point. This wasn't about proving anything to them. It was about proving something to myself, that I could walk into that room, surrounded by curated perfection, and stand fully in who I was. Not the version they tolerated, the woman I had become. Still, as the day drew closer, anxiety swelled in my chest like a rising tide. Would they see me? Would they recognize what they'd missed? Or would they do what they'd always done, look straight through me? Either way, I was done hiding. And ready or not, the curtain was about to rise. The morning of the dinner came quietly. It was gray outside, one of those New York mornings where the light feels a little distant, like the sky is holding its breath. I made coffee in silence, wrapped my father's gift in navy tissue paper, and laid it gently into a wooden box I'd had engraved with his initials. Then I stood in front of my closet. It wasn't just about what to wear, it was about what I wanted to say, without speaking. There were dresses in there that would have made a statement, ones I'd worn to galas and tech summits, gifts from investors, collaborations with rising designers who believed in our mission. But they felt like armor, beautiful but heavy, too sharp for the message I needed to send. Instead, I chose the black one, simple, clean lines. The fabric hugged just enough to feel graceful, but not indulgent. It was the kind of dress that didn't demand attention, but refused to apologize for existing. I paired it with a delicate silver bracelet and those small pearl earrings that had once belonged to my grandmother, the only woman in my family who had ever made me feel completely enough, just as I was. I applied a touch of lipstick, soft rose, not bold red. I ran a brush through my hair, left it loose over my shoulders. I looked in the mirror and didn't see a disguise. I saw a woman who had stopped trying to earn her seat. And just as I was putting on my coat, my phone buzzed. It was Maya. Maya Nguyen, my best friend since college, and the one person outside Brightpath who knew the whole story. She'd stood by me through 3 a.m. code sprints, through panic attacks over payroll, through the first heartbreaking rejection from a school district we desperately wanted to help. Her text said only, "You already won, don't forget that." I smiled, warmth spreading through the nerves still curled in my stomach. Then the phone rang. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" she asked when I picked up. "As ready as I'll ever be," I said, steadying my voice. "I still think it's wild you've kept all of this from them," she said. "But I get it. Just promise me you'll protect your peace, no matter how this goes." "I will." There was a pause on the line, the kind that only exists between two people who know each other too well. "Remember," she said, You don't owe them a show. You're not going there to prove anything. You're going to stand in your truth. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Exactly. And for the first time in years, I believed that. As I walked out the door into the crisp evening air, coat wrapped tightly around me, I felt a strange stillness settle in my chest. Not fear, not even anger, just clarity. Whatever happened at Maison Étoile, I would no longer be the quiet sister in the corner. I would walk into that room fully myself, and this time, I wasn't going to shrink. The ride to Maison Étoile took 25 minutes, but my mind traveled much farther. As the cab weaved through the city, I watched the buildings blur past, my reflection flickering faintly in the window. I thought of my father's smile when I was little, the way he used to cheer at my spelling bee wins like they were Super Bowl touchdowns. I thought of my mother brushing my hair before school, humming softly, before image became everything. I almost forgot who they used to be. Halfway there, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a call. Maya. I didn't hesitate. Hey, I said quietly, resting my hand over the gift box on my lap. Hey, yourself, she replied, her voice familiar and grounding. Tell me you're not halfway to canceling. I laughed under my breath. No, I'm in the cab, almost there. Good, she said. Then, after a beat, how's your heart? That question got me more than I expected. It's steady, I answered, but heavy. There was a pause. You know you don't have to go in there as a symbol, she said gently. You're not a lesson. You're a person. You don't need to prove anything to them to make your life meaningful. I know, I whispered, but I think I need to show up for me this time. Not to be seen by them, but to stop disappearing from myself. That was the truth of it. For years, I'd made myself smaller around them, not because they asked me to, but because I believed that was the only way to earn a seat at their table. Now, I just wanted to stop shrinking. I get it, Maya said, her voice softer now. But don't let their blindness make you doubt your vision. If they can't see you, it says everything about them, and nothing about you. I nodded slowly, my eyes stinging just a little. You always know what to say. That's because I've seen all the versions of you, she said. The one who coded through flu season, the one who cried over a school in Georgia that couldn't afford pencils, the one who stayed up all night to figure out a workaround for a nonverbal child's learning app. I smiled. You make me sound heroic. You are, she said simply. The cab slowed as we pulled up in front of the restaurant. Warm light spilled onto the sidewalk, and I saw the valet already assisting some sleek black car, probably Nicholas's. I'm here, I said, suddenly breathless. You've been here the whole time, she replied. Now just go in, be exactly who you are, no more and no less. And with that, I ended the call. I stepped out into the night, coat wrapped tightly around me, and felt the weight of everything I wasn't carrying anymore. No need to perform, no need to pretend, just me. And somehow, that finally felt like enough. The doorman greeted me with a small nod as I stepped under the golden awning of Maison Étoile. The cold evening air clung to my coat as I exhaled slowly and handed the wooden box to the hostess at the front with both hands. Good evening, Miss Carter, she said with a warm familiarity that caught me off guard for a second. It's lovely to see you again. Hi, Sophia, I replied softly. I'd been here many times before, for Bright Path fundraisers, investor dinners, and even quiet lunches with educators we were trying to support. I knew the chef by name. The staff recognized my preferences. Emmanuel, the owner, once joked that I should have my name etched onto a table plaque. But tonight, none of that could show. I'm here for a private dinner under Carter, I added, as if we didn't already both know. For my father's birthday. Sophia scanned the guest list on her tablet, her brow briefly furrowing. Oh, she said. Of course. The private dining room is ready. We weren't expecting... She hesitated, then added delicately, You to be part of that party." I offered her a tight smile. "That makes two of us." She glanced up from the screen and met my eyes with something like empathy. "Would you like me to let Emmanuel know you're here?" "Actually," I hesitated. "If you could keep it discreet, for now, I'd appreciate it." Sophia nodded slowly, understanding what I wasn't saying out loud. "Of course, Miss Carter. Discretion is our specialty." I moved toward the lounge area, settling into a quiet corner beneath a chandelier shaped like an inverted garden. A waiter brought over a glass of sparkling water without needing to ask. I could see the skyline stretching wide through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city looked calm, detached, indifferent in the way only New York could be. And for a moment, so was I. Then I heard them. The unmistakable sound of my mother's laughter, crisp and rehearsed. My father's deliberate footsteps, Nicholas's exaggerated greeting to the valet, making sure the crowd got a glimpse of whatever imported machine he'd driven tonight. I turned slightly in my seat, just enough to watch them arrive. Alexandra in some glittering designer gown that probably cost more than my first year of rent. Her husband adjusting his cufflinks as if the air had been waiting. My mother's coat shimmered with tiny gold threads, her necklace loud enough to draw attention from across the room. None of them noticed me sitting there, which I suppose was poetic. I watched my father shake hands with a man I recognized from a real estate gala 2 years ago, one who'd once asked me if I was with the catering team when I spoke at a development summit. They moved as a unit, elegant, curated, oblivious, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I needed to catch up to them. I just needed to decide when I was ready to be seen. I stood slowly, smoothing the front of my dress with one hand and steadying the gift box in the other. It felt heavier now, not because of its weight, but because of what it symbolized. A daughter's quiet attempt at connection, offered to a man who once told bedtime stories about building from nothing, but now barely made eye contact if there wasn't a handshake attached. I walked toward them, heels clicking softly against marble tile, each step a mixture of dread and resolve. "Happy birthday, Dad," I said, gently offering the box. My father turned, distracted mid-conversation with another guest. His expression flickered with something, surprise maybe, but quickly reshaped itself into polite detachment. "Isabelle," he nodded. "Thank you for coming." No hug. No warmth, his eyes already scanning the room again. My mother was next. She blinked twice, scanning my dress, my shoes, my face, assessing as always. "You could have worn something with a little more color," she whispered, lips barely moving. "It's a celebration, not a funeral." I gave a quiet, practiced smile. "It's nice to see you too, Mom." Alexandra leaned in for an air kiss, her hand grazing my shoulder like I might wrinkle her sleeve. "You look comfortable," she said, eyes glinting. "Are they still paying you hourly at the bookstore?" I breathed through the sting. "Actually, I'm not at the store much these days." She gave a half laugh. "Oh? Did it finally close?" Before I could respond, Nicholas swooped in, draping an arm around my shoulder with performative charm. "Baby sis still rocking the thrift shop vibe, huh?" He grinned, turning to one of my father's colleagues. "Isn't she precious? So authentic." I felt heat rise in my chest, but kept my tone even. "I'd rather wear something I love than something that needs its own security detail." He smirked. "Well, when you're ready for an upgrade, I'll take you shopping. Consider it an early birthday present." My fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the box, not out of anger, out of repetition. This was the same playbook, just recycled with better lighting, and somewhere in the middle of all that glitter and laughter, I saw it for what it was. Not malice, exactly, but a kind of blindness, a refusal to see anything that didn't sparkle the way they were taught to value. I glanced down at my father's gift, still unopened in his hands, and wondered how many more years I'd keep offering parts of myself only to watch them go unwrapped. Still, I followed them as the maitre d' approached to lead us toward the private dining room, because this time I wasn't going to sit quietly on the edge. This time, I was walking in with eyes wide open. The maitre d' extended his arm with polished grace. "Mr. Carter, the private dining room is ready. If you and your guests would follow me?" The group moved as one, heels clicking, shoes gleaming, laughter trailing behind them like perfume. I fell into step just a few feet behind, clutching my small black purse in one hand, the warmth of my father's unopened gift fading fast in the other. Then, halfway down the corridor, Alexandra suddenly slowed and turned. She placed one manicured hand gently on my arm, but her grip was firmer than it needed to be. "Isabelle," she murmured, her voice just above a whisper, though I noticed more than one guest nearby perk up their ears. "Don't you think you're a bit underdressed for this kind of place?" I blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" She leaned in, smile fixed, voice saccharine. "Maison Étoile isn't exactly casual dining, and the menu doesn't list prices. I'm just concerned you might feel out of place." Before I could respond, Nicholas appeared beside us, champagne flute in hand. "I told you," he said to her, shaking his head with a faux sigh. "We should have picked somewhere more accessible. There's a cute little bistro on 5th with coupons and everything." I took a step back, pulse pounding. "I'm fine," I said, keeping my tone steady. "I'm here to celebrate Dad." Alexandra tilted her head. "That's the thing, though. We just thought maybe it might be better if you joined us for dessert, after dinner." I stared at her. "You want me to wait? In the bar?" She shrugged. "It's just, some of Dad's most important clients are here tonight, and we thought maybe the focus should stay on him." I laughed softly, more out of disbelief than humor. "You're worried I'll embarrass you in front of people who don't even know me." Nicholas sipped his drink and smirked. "Come on, no need to be dramatic. It's not personal. You know how optics work." My mother, drawn by the stalled procession, appeared beside them. "What's going on?" Alexandra turned to her. "We were just thinking Isabelle might be more comfortable waiting in the lounge. The seating is tight and, well," Victoria didn't miss a beat, "it's probably for the best." And there it was, the final sting, the clear message beneath the smile. You're not enough. Not for this table. Not for this night. Not for us. I looked from one face to the next. My sister's cool calculation, my brother's smug amusement, my mother's well-practiced mask. My father, a few feet ahead, hadn't even turned around. And suddenly, I wasn't a 32-year-old woman anymore. I was 12 again, being told to sit at the kids' table while my siblings got real china and conversation. But this time, I didn't move. "I'll join you for dinner," I said firmly. Alexandra blinked. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" "More than sure," I replied. "Unless, of course, this isn't really a family celebration." A few heads turned. The maitre d' cleared his throat awkwardly, still waiting to lead us in, and I took my first full breath of the night. Because I wasn't going to fade into the background this time. Not anymore. The tension lingered in the corridor like perfume too thick for the space. I stood there, still as glass, while my family silently dared me to step back, to know my place, to take the hint. I didn't move. But before anyone could say another word, a new voice broke the standoff. "Miss Carter," the maitre d' said gently, stepping forward. "Is everything all right?" I turned to him, his concern genuine. His eyes weren't on Alexandra or Nicholas or my mother. They were on me. "Yes," I said calmly. "We're just figuring out seating." At that moment, a security staffer approached, one I recognized from past events we'd held here. He stopped mid-step, glanced between my family and me, and then his posture changed. Upright, respectful, alert. "Miss Carter," he nodded. "Madam CEO. Your usual table is always available if you'd prefer that instead." Silence. Immediate. Complete. I felt the air shift behind me. My family froze. Nicholas's smirk vanished mid-tilt. Alexandra's lips parted, but no sound came out. My mother stiffened, her perfectly practiced expression cracking like a porcelain teacup dropped too suddenly. Before anyone could recover, another familiar voice emerged. "Miss Carter!" Emmanuel, the owner of Maison Étoile, swept toward us in his tailored suit, his face lit with the kind of warmth he reserved for old friends and top patrons. "Had I known you were joining us tonight, we would have prepared the balcony suite." He turned to the stunned group beside me. "You're her guests, I presume?" The floor seemed to tilt under their heels, but Emmanuel wasn't done. "Stephanie." He paused, correcting himself with a soft laugh. "Forgive me, Isabelle. Hosted one of our most successful charitable galas last quarter. Raised over $2 million for early childhood literacy programs. Truly extraordinary." My father, who had only just turned back to face us, blinked slowly, as if he was seeing me for the first time in years, maybe ever. Then came the final note, so casual it was surgical. "Of course," Emmanuel added. "None of this would have been possible if she hadn't acquired this building last year. A bold investment. Brilliant, really." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was seismic. Every carefully constructed assumption about me cracked in an instant, splintering beneath the weight of what they'd never bothered to ask. I felt my breath settle in my chest, no longer shallow. I turned to Alexandra, whose face had gone ghostly. "Still think I should wait in the bar?" No answer. I looked at Nicholas. His mouth opened slightly, like he might object, but even he knew better now. I didn't need to announce anything. I hadn't staged a reveal or delivered a dramatic speech. I had simply stood still and let the truth arrive. There was a beat, just one. But in that pause, I felt everything shift. The energy in the room, the weight in the air, the way my family looked at me. It was as if someone had pulled back a curtain and revealed a completely different stage. And I was no longer the understudy. Alexandra recovered first, of course. She always had the fastest reflexes when it came to social repositioning. She let out a too-bright laugh, brushing invisible lint from her sleeve. "Well, you could have told us, Isabelle. We wouldn't have—" She glanced around and smiled tightly. "We wouldn't have made such a scene." Nicholas stepped closer, his voice suddenly softer. "You always were full of surprises," he said. "This whole time. You've been doing what exactly?" My mother placed a hand on my arm, as if we'd been the closest of confidants all along. "Darling, had I known you were building something so important, I would have introduced you to the Devereaux last summer. They've been looking for educational projects to support." I pulled gently away, offering nothing more than a nod. Because what they didn't understand, what they still didn't see, was that this wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about having the last word. It was about the years I had quietly lived beneath their judgment, never once asking them to see my worth through a title or evaluation. And now, standing in the wake of this revelation, I saw it clearly. Their respect had a price tag. But I wasn't selling. Emmanuel, ever the graceful host, gestured toward the private dining room. "Shall we? I'll have the chef send out something special for Miss Carter and her guests." I walked forward, this time at the front of the group, not trailing behind. The hallway was the same. The chandeliers hadn't changed, but everything inside me had. And as we entered the private room, with its sweeping views of the city and its long, glistening table, I caught my father's expression. It wasn't pride, not yet. But it wasn't indifference either. It was curiosity. And for now, that was enough. The private dining room at Maison Étoile looked like something out of a film, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic sweep of Manhattan's skyline, chandeliers dripping with crystal, and a long mahogany table set with gold-rimmed china and polished silverware. It should have felt grand, but all I felt was the shift. No one rushed to sit near my father the way they used to. Instead, they subtly positioned themselves closer to me, as if power had changed chairs, and they were adjusting their proximity accordingly. I took my seat with quiet composure, midway down the table, where no one had ever saved me a spot before. Tonight, the waiter addressed me by name. He didn't ask for my drink order. He already knew. I saw the way Alexandra angled herself toward one of my father's clients, trying to reclaim her spotlight by sheer force of charm. Nicholas was suddenly more subdued, his usual bravado edged with something that looked a lot like uncertainty. And my mother? She had fully transitioned into revisionist history. "I always told her she had something special," she said to the woman seated next to her, a socialite with a diamond the size of a blueberry on her finger. "She gets it from me, of course, always thinking outside the box." I didn't flinch. Because the truth was, I expected this. They had never seen me until someone else did, and now that my worth had been validated publicly, they were scrambling to rewrite the narrative, to graft themselves onto a version of me they could be proud of, as if that would make up for the years they had ignored the version that simply wanted to be heard. Between courses, guests began to approach me. A tech investor whose firm I'd once turned down offered his card again, all smiles. A superintendent who had declined a Bright Path demo now expressed deep interest in a potential partnership. I nodded politely, said little, and kept my answers brief. Because none of it felt real. Not the flattery, not the sudden warmth, not the way my family laughed a little too loudly at my quietest comments. It was all performance, just one with different lighting. And yet, as I looked across the table, I saw my father watching me, not distracted, not preoccupied, just watching. Like he was starting to realize there was more to the daughter he'd overlooked for so long. It wasn't much, but it was something. The appetizers were served with synchronized precision: truffle-topped risotto, chilled scallop crudo, artfully smeared sauces I didn't bother to name. The presentation was flawless, like everything else in this room. But beneath the surface, I felt the cracks widening, not in the table, in the people. Diana, Alexandra, was already performing. She sat angled just right toward one of my father's wealthiest clients, tossing out law firm names and recent victories like confetti. Her laugh rang a little too loud, too rehearsed. Nicholas mirrored her on the opposite side, talking about a celebrity patient whose identity he couldn't reveal, though he made sure we all knew who it was. But even he glanced toward me between sentences, as if waiting to see how I responded, as if my approval now held weight. My mother busied herself with social storytelling, adding flourishes to the fiction she'd started earlier. "Isabelle's always had a curious mind," she said, waving her wine glass. "We encouraged her creativity from the start." I didn't correct her. There was no point, because what became clearer with each passing minute wasn't just that they were revising history, but that they needed me now. Not as a daughter, not even as family, as leverage. I could see the silent recalculations in their eyes. My presence, once tolerated, was now a currency, and they were already spending it. "Tell everyone about your company," Alexandra said, loud enough to turn heads. "You've been so mysterious for years." "Yes," Nicholas added, forcing a laugh. "We always knew you were up to something impressive, just didn't know it was this." I looked between them, a strange calm washing over me. They hadn't changed. They'd just shifted strategies. And suddenly I felt a wave of grief I hadn't expected. Not anger, not pride. Grief for the moments that could have been real, if only they'd cared to look sooner. I sipped my water, placed my napkin gently in my lap, and spoke with a voice I barely recognized as my own. Strong, steady, clear. "I built something that matters, not because I needed your approval, but because I stopped chasing it." The table went quiet for just a beat. Then the waiter arrived with the next course, shattering the stillness with practiced ease, and the performance resumed. But I wasn't in it anymore. I was simply watching. The second course arrived, seared duck with fig glaze, resting on a bed of wild grains. I barely touched it. The conversation at the table had returned to its usual rhythm: stock market chatter, destination vacations, and polite one-upmanship masked as small talk. The spotlight had quietly shifted off me, though I could still feel the residual tension in the air like static. Then I heard his voice. My father. He hadn't said much all evening. Aside from a few polite thank yous and quiet nods, he'd remained a spectator in his own celebration. But now, he turned to me fully, his hand resting lightly on the stem of his wine glass. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" he asked. The table quieted. No one interrupted. It was the first genuine question he'd asked me in years, and suddenly I felt every version of myself across time staring back at him. The child who brought him hand-drawn charts, the teenager who waited up for his approval, the adult who finally gave up asking. I set down my fork and met his gaze. "Because it wouldn't have mattered," I said quietly. "Not in the way that should matter between family." My mother's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Alexandra shifted uncomfortably. Even Nicholas stopped chewing. My father frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I continued, "for years, when you all thought I was barely making ends meet, no one asked if I was happy. No one cared what I believed in. It was always about what I wore, who I knew, how I compared to Alexandra or Nicholas." He looked down at his plate, and for once he didn't interrupt. "You didn't see me," I said, voice steady. "Not when I won my first writing competition at 14, not when I made the dean's list all through college. You saw my choices as mistakes because they didn't look like success to you." I paused, then added, "I wanted to build something meaningful, but I also wanted to know, if I didn't look impressive on paper, would I still be worthy of your attention?" Across the table, silence held like a breath. Then, slowly, my father spoke. "I thought I was pushing you to reach your potential." I nodded. "Maybe you were. But what you really taught me was that my worth only existed if someone else could admire it." There it was. Years of confusion, years of resentment, hurt, and silence, distilled into a few sentences. He stared at his glass for a long moment before finally saying, "Will you come with me to the terrace?" I didn't hesitate. I stood, the chair gliding back with a soft whisper, and followed him through the tall glass doors, leaving the noise of the dining room behind. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what might be said next, because I had already said what mattered most. The terrace was quiet, tucked just beyond the grand dining room, separated by tall glass doors and a row of flickering candles. The air was cooler out here, crisp with late winter's breath, but it felt easier to inhale. My father walked to the railing, his hands resting on the polished stone as he stared out at the skyline. His shoulders looked heavier than I remembered. Not older, just weighed down in a way I hadn't seen before. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then finally he said, "I had a whole speech planned tonight." I waited. "It was about legacy," he continued, "about building something from the ground up. Sacrifice, discipline, all the usual things I thought mattered." He turned toward me. "But now I'm realizing, maybe I never saw you clearly, and I don't know how that happened." The words settled between us like snow, soft but undeniable. I stepped closer, the lights from the city casting quiet shadows across his face. "It didn't happen all at once," I said. "It was gradual, 1,000 small moments, where I stopped bringing you news you didn't seem to want, where I learned that silence hurt less than rejection." He nodded slowly, gaze dropping to the ground. "When you were little," he said, "you used to run to me with your notebooks, pages of drawings and ideas. You always had something new you were dreaming up. And I loved that." "So what changed?" I asked. "I did," he said, voice low. "The business took over. The pressure, the hunger to prove myself, to be more than where I came from. I promised myself my kids would never feel the shame I did growing up." But we still did, I whispered, just in a different form. He winced at that. Subtle, but real. I didn't see it, he admitted. I thought I was protecting you, but I was pushing you to be someone I understood. And when you chose a different path, I didn't know how to follow you there. We stood in silence for a few more seconds, both of us facing the city. But finally, facing the truth, too. Then he glanced sideways. The treatment, he said. After my heart attack. The one that wasn't covered by insurance. That was you, wasn't it? I didn't speak. I didn't need to. He exhaled slowly, then looked at me. Really looked. Why didn't you tell me? Would you have let me? I asked softly. Would you have accepted help from the daughter you thought was struggling to afford rent? His face fell, not in shame, but in realization. No, he said. I wouldn't have. We stood there a little longer, just two people stripped of titles and years of misunderstanding. And then, quietly, he said, I'd like to get to know you again. Not as a CEO, not as someone who surprised us all, just as my daughter, if you'll let me. My throat tightened. I'd like that too, Dad. And somehow, in that cold air, something began to thaw. When I returned to the dining room, the hum of conversation had resumed, but everything felt softer somehow. The tension that had wrapped around me like a second skin for most of the evening had loosened, just slightly. I took my seat again. My mother was watching me. She stood a few minutes later and touched my arm gently. Would you come with me to the powder room? It was a request wrapped in formality, but something in her eyes hinted at more. I followed. The restroom was lavish, of course. Marble counters, soft lighting, hand towels folded like origami. She checked her lipstick in the mirror, then turned toward me, and for a moment she just stared. I don't know what to say, she whispered. I feel like I don't know you at all. I let the words hang in the air. Then I answered, That's because you never tried to. Her expression faltered, just a flicker, but it was enough to tell me she heard the truth in it. She reached into her clutch for a tissue, dabbing under her eyes with practiced elegance. I just wanted you to have everything I didn't. You have no idea what it felt like, growing up with secondhand shoes, being laughed at for not knowing which fork to use, never being invited to the right places. And I understand that, I said gently. But somewhere along the way, you started pushing your shame onto me, onto all of us. You wanted perfection so badly you stopped seeing people, including your own daughter. She looked away, her voice tight. Alexandra and Nicholas, they were easier. They wanted the same things I did. You always asked questions I didn't know how to answer. That sentence stopped me, because it was true. I had always been the one asking, challenging, wondering why things had to be a certain way, why appearances mattered more than emotions, why worth had to come with a receipt. I didn't need you to have all the answers, I said. I just needed you to stop comparing me to people I was never meant to become. For the first time all night, she looked directly at me, not as an image to critique or a reputation to manage, but as her daughter. I am proud of what you've built, Isabelle, she said, voice softer now. I just wish I'd understood it earlier. You could have, I replied. You still can, but only if we stop pretending. She nodded slowly. I'm tired of pretending. It wasn't an apology, but it was a start. The soft clink of glasses and low murmur of conversation followed me down the hallway. I needed air, or maybe just a place without mirrors, without expectations. Instead, I found Alexandra. She was alone in the coat room, her hand wrapped around a crystal glass of champagne that was no longer cold. She turned as I entered. Her expression didn't shift into the usual polite smile. It stayed flat, exhausted. Here to gloat? She asked, voice clipped. I blinked, startled. No, I was just what? She cut in, her laugh brittle. Just making your rounds? You've had your moment, Isabelle. The toast, the surprise, The shock. Everyone's still buzzing out there. You win. I closed the door behind me, gently. This wasn't about winning. She raised an eyebrow. Of course it was. It always is. You think you're so different from the rest of us, but you're not. You just want validation. Same as I do. Same as everyone. I stepped closer. I wanted acknowledgement, Alexandra. Not applause, not a medal. Just recognition that I mattered. She looked down into her drink, then back at me, and something in her posture sagged. You don't think I saw you? She said, quieter now. All those years in the background, always working, always listening. I saw it, but if I acknowledged it, I'd have to admit you were stronger than me. That stopped me cold. Alexandra's voice trembled. Mom and Dad put me on this pedestal so early, I didn't know how to get down without breaking. Every step I took had to look effortless. Every mistake had to be buried. Do you know how suffocating that is? For the first time, I didn't see the curated version of my sister, the one with perfect posture and poised applause. I saw the fear, the pressure, the cracks. I never wanted your spotlight, I said gently. I just wanted my own space to breathe. She nodded slowly. I think I hated you for leaving, she admitted, because I wanted to, but I didn't have the courage. And when I heard about the bookstore, I thought, at least she failed. At least she's human. Her eyes glistened. But you didn't fail, she whispered. You built something. You survived. You flourished. I exhaled. And you still can too, Alex, I said. We don't have to play their roles anymore. We can write our own. For the first time, her face softened into something real, something sisterly. Maybe we start with a coffee, she offered. Someplace quiet, no designers, no last names. I smiled. I'd like that. And just like that, the space between us began to shift, from rivalry to something closer to redemption. The celebration had started to wind down, laughter faded into farewells, and coats began to disappear from the rack. I stood near the back patio doors, watching candlelight flicker against the glass, when I heard the quietest voice behind me. You surprised everyone tonight. I turned. Nicholas. He looked exactly as he always did. Pressed shirt, calm eyes, hands tucked into his pockets like they belonged there. But something in his tone had changed. You okay? I asked softly. He nodded, then paused. You know, growing up, I used to think silence was safety. If I stayed quiet, stayed agreeable, no one would expect too much from me. No one would be disappointed. He stepped closer, gaze steady. But tonight, watching you speak, watching everyone finally see you, it made me realize I've been disappearing in plain sight. That admission hit harder than I expected. I always thought you were the balanced one, I murmured. The peacemaker. I was just scared, he said. Scared of becoming the disappointment they warned us not to be. Scared that if I ever spoke up, I'd lose their approval. A pause. Then, and scared that if I did speak up, I wouldn't say anything worth hearing. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat. You're saying something now. He offered a faint smile. That's because you made room for it. I wasn't sure what to say next, but he continued. I read about your company a while back, he admitted. I saw the partnerships, the educational grants. I just didn't know how to bring it up without revealing how small I felt in comparison. You don't have to compare, I said gently. That's the lie they raised us on, that love had to be earned through achievement. He nodded slowly. I want to unlearn that. I want to know you outside of what they told me you were. My breath caught in my chest. That means everything to me, Nick. His eyes softened. It should have started sooner. But I'm here now. And in that moment, I realized something that all the success in the world hadn't given me. this quiet connection, this honest beginning. Nicholas reached out and gave me a brief but meaningful hug. It wasn't grand. It wasn't showy. But it was real. And for once, that was enough. The last of the champagne flutes had been cleared, the string lights dimmed, and only a faint murmur lingered from the kitchen. I slipped upstairs to the guest room where I'd left my coat and bag. The hall, once buzzing with expectation and distant laughter, now echoed with a quiet stillness. I paused by the window, letting my fingers rest on the frame. From here, I could see the ivy that clung to the estate walls, stubborn and wild, just like I had always felt. I didn't need a grand goodbye, no dramatic final scene, just this, a quiet acknowledgement that I had come, I had spoken, and I had left something behind, not a legacy for them to approve of, but a truth they could no longer ignore. When I turned to leave, I found my father standing at the end of the hall. He didn't speak right away, just looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, part confusion, part restraint, and maybe, just maybe, the tiniest flicker of something like regret. "I didn't expect," he began, then trailed off. "I know," I replied gently. "You never did." He looked down, then back up. "You could have told us." I shook my head. "You weren't listening." He flinched, just slightly. "I don't hate you," I said softly. "But I also don't owe you the version of me that makes you comfortable." There was silence between us, but for once, it didn't feel heavy, just necessary. "I'm proud of who I've become," I added, "even if you never say it." And with that, I walked past him, not out of anger, but out of peace. Down the staircase, through the foyer, and past the doors where the driver waited with the engine running. I handed him my bag and took one last breath of the crisp Connecticut air. The version of me that used to wait by those doors, hoping to be chosen, heard, or seen, she was gone. In her place stood a woman who had stopped asking for permission to be whole. I didn't slam the door. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The train ride back to Boston was quiet, but not hollow, just still enough to think, without spiraling. As the skyline came into view, I felt a soft exhale leave my body, like I'd been holding it for years without realizing. There was no parade waiting for me, no celebratory text from family, but there was something better, my key turning smoothly in the lock of my own front door. I stepped inside, dropped my bag by the entryway, and kicked off my shoes. The quiet of my apartment didn't feel lonely, it felt earned. The walls here didn't hold judgment or comparison, just stories I had built, decision by decision, risk by risk. My office still smelled faintly of coffee and whiteboard ink. Notes from last week's call with the UNICEF team sat on my desk, next to a signed check from a recent investor. Everything here bore my fingerprints, not just as a founder, but as a woman who had survived being underestimated. I lit a candle, curled into my reading chair, and opened my laptop, not out of urgency, but choice. There was a message waiting in my inbox from a young teacher in Ohio who had used our platform to help her students access tutoring in a district that had nearly lost its funding. She ended the note with, "I don't know who you are, but what you built is changing lives." I stared at it for a long time. Not because I needed the validation, but because it reminded me that impact doesn't need permission. And it certainly doesn't need a seat at someone else's dinner table. That night, I cooked myself dinner. Nothing fancy, just rosemary chicken and garlic potatoes. But it was mine. I ate by the window, watching the amber glow of the street lamps flicker against the pavement. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't wonder what they were doing back home. I didn't flinch at the thought of being excluded. I just existed, fully, unapologetically, and it was enough. It's strange how silence becomes a friend when you've spent years chasing noise. I used to believe that love had to be earned, through performance, through obedience, through silence. I thought if I just did everything right, stayed humble, stayed helpful, maybe then they would see me. Maybe then I would finally belong. But what I've learned, painfully, slowly, is that people who want to misunderstand you will do so no matter how kind, how accomplished, or how generous you are. And sometimes, the deepest betrayal doesn't come from enemies. It comes from the people you thought were your foundation. I don't share this story for pity. I share it for those who've ever sat in the back seat of their own life to make room for others, for the eldest daughters, the quiet sons, the black sheep, the hidden successes, for anyone who's ever been told, keep your voice down, don't make things awkward, be grateful for what you're given. Let me say this clearly. You're allowed to want more. You're allowed to set boundaries. You are not selfish for refusing to be emotionally manipulated. And choosing peace, even if it means losing people, is not weakness. It's clarity. My name is Isabelle Carter. I built something in the dark that now brings light to thousands. And while my family still may not see me, I do. I see every scar, every late night, every broken moment I stitched back together quietly. And I honor her now, fully, freely. So wherever you are in your story, know this. You don't have to wait for their permission to begin again. You don't need a family that only celebrates a version of you that makes them comfortable. You can redefine love, home, and success on your own terms. And if this story spoke to you, if even one moment made you feel a little less alone, then please, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this channel. And leave a comment below. Your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. You're not alone, and you never were.